Sometimes to sleep better, I listen to lobotomy ASMR. Great, now I know that the audio works. So, just like the South Africa video that I made, this is gonna be a quick introduction. Um, I won't talk about every vehicle and give you all the details and stuff. Instead, I'll give you a few of my favorite examples of Brazilian armor. Usually, when we think about South American designs, or South American countries, we think of a weird modernization. But if I told you that Brazil not only had an arms industry, but also competed with USA, France, and Britain, you would be surprised, because I was. Right, let's first start off with some history. How did Brazil go from having hand me downs from America to an Osorio? So, having your own MBT program is pretty impressive, and most countries will import stuff. A few will have a modernization program, and a few will just produce spare parts and buy some foreign designs. Very few actually get to design their own stuff. So, at first, around in the 60s, let's just say Brazil was having political issues. And America said to them, hey, we won't sell you shit because politics. And Brazil responded with, vai se foder, babaca. And they went on to become more independent on arms. They looked at the arsenal of the M8 Greyhound, the M3 Stuart, and the M41 Bulldog. First off, they started modifying the M8, and it was things like modify the engine and wheels, and they came up with this. And then the higher ups said, Eu quero seis rodas. So they modified it again, and gaining the experience from those two adventures, they looked at a really cool thing called a boomerang suspension that allows you to have traction all the time, even in very bad terrain, which could be common in South America. Then they got a French 90mm gun, put all those ideas together, and that is when you get a cascavel, which means rattlesnake. And oh boy, does this filho da puta have a strong bite, and also a small stature, but we respect our small kings here on this channel. Thanks to the boomerang suspension, it would never have issues in the South American terrain. The gun would be more than enough to wreck a Leopard 1, AMX-30, M60, ATAM, or any other MBT fielded at the time in the region. The 90mm was a Brazilian version of the French 90mm. In South African service, those would deal with T55 armor, so a lot of Western style MBTs wouldn't be an issue either at the time. The gun wasn't stabilized though, and it fired only heat, HE, and smoke. There was a 50 cal on the roof, and there was also a coaxial machine gun. And this was primarily meant for recon. And a quick word from me. The American M3 Bradley is also for recon, and it's tall. Meanwhile the Cascavel, well, it's shorter. Also isn't as fat as the American M3. Funny how America has an obesity issue also with their armoured vehicles. But I still love them. And also USA makes vehicles which my countries use. Okay, but back to Brazil. The Cascavel didn't have a stabilizer, and that's because, well, when they were designing this, they had a property in mind, and it's to make it cheap because Brazil wanted to show itself to the world as we will sell you things cheap and we won't ask questions. That's why a lot of third world countries would have a lot of them. And it did have things like night vision, a laser rangefinder, and the gun could depress 8 degrees and elevate 15. Patrzcie kacapy, nawet Brazylijczycy umieją normalnie dać depresję armacie. Ale w sumie jak o tym pomyślę, to ruskie społeczeństwo nadrabia tę presję za wasze armaty. The armor will frontally protect you from 12.7mm rounds and the sights from rifle and machine gun fire. Like a BTR, but unlike the BTR, the Cascavel can molest you in 4 dimensions, just like a drone can molest a Su-57. Now let's talk about the main part, the mobility. It weighed about 12 tons, it was about 6.3 meters long, and that would be on the turret. The hull was about 5.25 meters long, it was 2.6 meters wide, and 2.6 meters tall. It had a 3-man crew, a commander, it had a driver, it had a gunner, and the engine. It was a Detroit diesel 6V53N 5.2 litre 6-cylinder water-cooled diesel. It had about 212 horsepower and 2.8 thousand RPM, giving it about 15.8 horsepower per ton, which for that weight is pretty good. 6x6 double axle boomerang drive, and it had the fuel capacity to go about 750 kilometers, and it could also traverse terrain at a speed of 100 kilometers an hour. In conclusion, you get a vehicle which is cheap, compact, it has good firepower, it's capable of wrecking an IFV and an APC and most MBTs of its time. It's mobile, it has light armor, and it's great for missions like recon. Now next designs. Now we're gonna talk about prototypes and modernizations and stuff like that. So first of all, the Tamayo. How did we get to the Tamayo? So Brazil had a load of M41 Bulldogs. Brazil would rarely use heavy MBTs or anything like that. And if you look at the vehicles they used, they never went beyond 40 tons, and it's something that they still keep to. Many countries would buy the M41 at the time as well, because it was a light tank. And the M48, for example, in 1975 would cost you about 280,000. Meanwhile, the M41, 162,000. A lot of countries like Brazil with a low budget and rough terrain would just prefer the Bulldog. It provides you decent firepower for the time and mobility. The ARVN loved the M41. But back to Brazil. I'll make a dedicated video about the M41 eventually, and it's gonna be for members only. What did Brazil do with the M41? First off, Bernardini, a company which constructed a lot of vehicles for Brazil, what they basically did is reconstructed the rear hull to fit a new engine and cooling fans and other stuff instead. It used to have it had a Continental AOS 895-3 6-cylinder air-cooled engine with about 500 horsepower. And the new Bulldog post-modernization would have a Saab Scania DS14A 8-cylinder diesel engine which had about 405 horsepower. And you may say, Hussar, that's less horsepower. Why the fuck would you do that? Well, you see, they needed an engine that was easier to maintain and produce. And like I stated before, USA stopped selling stuff to Brazil. So they did what the French did with the AMX-13, which is they bored it out. And then they made it into a 90mm, and then they just put a heat sleeve on it. And that was the M41B. Then there was also the M41C, which had a laser rangefinder. But anyway, about the gun. It could fire the same ammo as the Cascavel. Heat, HE, smoke. Then Brazil saw the TAM, the very cool Argentinian tank, which was also the logistics enjoyer's wet dream. Then Brazil said, merda. And let's just say the TAM beats the M41, and also the amount of TAM variants there are. And then they had a list of requirements to beat the TAM. And from this list of requirements, the Tamayo was born. So, here's the list. It needs to use as much parts from the M41 as possible. It has to use a 105 or a 120mm gun. It has to be stabilized. It needs to have day and night sights. Also, be mobile. First, there was the Tamayo 1, which they elongated the hull of an M41B, and then they added an extra road wheel, and they modified the turret of the X1, and they put a 76mm gun into it, and they saw it as an overall sort of, it's an idea of what it's gonna look like. More of a, we have concepts of a plan for a tank. Right, fast forward to the final design, the Tamayo 3. This had a 105mm gun, which was capable of wrecking a T-72A or M60 Patton, and also perfectly capable of being on par with the Argentinian TAM. And the Tamiya also had thermals. Unlike the TAM, unlike the T-72A and also the Patton, it also had the Forenti Falcon fire control system, which is very good at the time. And a lot of people say it was comparable to the Challenger 1. And guys, the Challenger 1 set the record for the longest direct fire tank-on-tank kill by getting it at 5 kilometers. And the indirect tank-on-tank kill is by a Ukrainian T-64, which is at 11 kilometers. Sorry, I just really had to brag about my country being badass. When it comes to firepower, it was pretty advanced. Now the turret armor. It would use a mix of composite and spaced armor. I couldn't find any diagrams or pictures, but I found out that the thickness of it was about 300 millimeters, meaning complete immunity to IFVs, APCs, and old anti-tank guns, or some light anti-tank guns. The 90mm was a very popular choice for a lot of countries at the time, and this could protect you from a 90mm. As for the armor, it would use spaced armor, and it would be about 27 to 55 millimeters. Now here's the sad part. They took the engine from the M41B and they shoved it into this. And just a little note, the Tamiya is way heavier. Therefore, you need way more power for it to move just as good. But they wanted to have it share as much parts as possible with the M41. The M41 had 22 horsepower per ton. The Tamiya had 16. So although it had better firepower for the 80s, good armor, if you say anything bad about this armor, just a reminder, the Leopard and AMX-30 and M60s were still around in thousands. And those didn't have composite armor on them, only based armor and ERA. So this was pretty advanced. And the mobility was its weakness. And then you guys, in charge of saying whether to put it in service or not, said, nah, I want to find those people and say to them, are you retarded or are you Russian? Similar, pretty close. Wow, who knew that if you get a medium tank or an MBT and you put light tank mobility stuff into it, it's gonna be slower. Anyway, overall, I still love the Tamiya, and I'm sad it didn't get approved. It was better than the Leopard 1 of its time, and it was at the level of an M60A3 TTS. And in my humble opinion, it's better than the TAM, and I simp for the TAM. And also when people don't look, I also look at the AMX-30, which I have a little fetish for, and I think that the Tamiya is better than the AMX-30. And you see, a few people wanted to get the Tamiya back in the 90s. But then, the greatest geopolitical event in the last decades happened, the fall of the Soviet Union. And people finally had freedom. So a lot of the users of the Leopard 1 said, you know what, we're not going to need this because there's no more communists to kill and have fun with them. And the market was basically flooded with a load of Leopard 1s, which killed any hope of a Tamiya revival. And then Brazil just bought a bunch of Leopard 1s. Okay, I have a little bit of a schizo theory. Be patient with me. What if you get the composites and you put them on the Leopard 1? You take the fire control system and you put it in the Leopard 1. Just, Brazilify the Leopard. But okay, with the schizo rant over, let's talk about another beauty which I wish entered production but didn't. The Osorio. Oh, I love that thing. So, right, the Osorio was a tank which was made for exports, and it relied heavily on foreign components. It had a British fire control system, French gun, it had also French optics, and it also had, if I remember correctly, a German engine. And the 120mm gun, let's talk about this. When a lot of people see it's a 120mm gun, they think it's the L44 by Rheinmetall. Well, it's actually a medium pressure gun that uses a bit different ammo. It is cheaper and it is lower recoil. Thanks to this, it puts much less stress on the tank's components, meaning they don't have to be built as strong. Also, they last longer and can have more rounds through them. The barrel life is much better. For example, the Challenger 2 gun. It can go through 400 APFS DS rounds before it has to get replaced. The German L-44 can go through 1,600 before it has to get replaced. Those are high pressure guns. And as for the ammo, this 120mm, which the Brazilians chose, could use APFSDS and HEAT-FS. Both of those would be able to defeat any export version of a T-72, which was fielded at the time by multiple countries. The Osório could also use a 105mm L7, which can fire APFSDS, HEAT, HESH, nowadays even HE, canister, smoke, you name it. Both of these guns would be more than capable of just wrecking T-72s, but not the T-72B though, which was just barely getting into service at the time. So majority of T-72 users and T-55 and T-62 users would basically get clapped. So now let's talk about the mobility of this. Well, it was about 40 tons, and also a lot of other features of the design speculated that it may have more in common than just a gun with the AMX-40, which a lot of members of my channel, guys, will get a video on it one day. So the Osório had a 12-cylinder diesel engine with 1,100 horsepower, giving it 26 horsepower per ton, which means, oh, it's fast. And it could go 70 kilometers forward. It had 4 forward gears and it had 2 reverse. It had a 4-man crew, driver, loader, gunner and commander. It had a coaxially mounted 50 cal and a roof mounted 50 cal, which I just want to say, I love that idea a lot. It's what the French do on the Leclerc, except they don't have a roof-mounted 50 cal, which really infuriates me. Now let's talk about the armor. So it used composite armor and also spaced armor, and it would consist of aluminium, carbon fiber, steel, different ceramics, and it would protect you from basic RPGs, M72 lore, and autocannons. And this was pretty normal for a lot of tanks at the time, especially in that weight category. It also had a hydropneumatic suspension. And as for the fire control system, the version with the 105mm gun had Belgian optics, and it also had night vision for the gunner and for the commander. The gunner had a ballistic computer and a laser rangefinder, which is more advanced than the T-72M. It was trialed in Saudi Arabia, going against the AMX-40, Challenger 1, and the M1A1 Abrams. The armament was disliked, so the Brazilians said, oh, this is just a placeholder, don't worry, and then they gave the Saudis the version with the 120mm, and this had French Generation 1 thermals, and the commander got a laser rangefinder, which is more advanced than early T-72B fire control system. Then, this improved version was shown to the Saudis, and now here's something interesting. Anyone who is interested in the Osório heard about this, the trial results. Many dispute and argue whether this actually happened, whether it's true, but I'm just gonna say this, believe whichever version you want to. There's a lot of sources which say it's true, and there's many which say it isn't. I'm not at that expert level, so yeah. However, I'm just gonna give you the results anyway. So the Saudis would test tanks by driving them for 2 months in the desert. Keep the engine running for about 6 hours while parked. They would have to tow a 30-something ton vehicle, and they would drive in reverse and then also go up a lot of slopes. They would have to go over a trench, and they would also have firing trials at the end. And a few years later, a Brazilian official said this: only the Osório could hit the targets at 4 kilometers, and when firing on the move and shooting at targets at 1,500, 2,000, and 2,500 meters, each tank would shoot about 15 times. The Osório would get 8 hits, Abrams 5, AMX-40 and Challenger 1, and yeah. And in a straight line, it would leave everyone else in the dust at the distance of 400 kilometers race. The Osório was pretty good. So in 1988, Saudi Arabia said, you know what, we're just going to use the Abrams. And then the Osorio was in the UAE. And that's where it competed against the AMX 40 again, and this time against the C1 Arieta. Wait. The Arieta? What the fuck? How is that even a competition? But no one chose the Osorio in the end. Depending on which source you read, there is either 5 or 2 prototypes made, and Brazil didn't buy it either. Engesa, the company which made it, filed for bankruptcy. So, in conclusion of all of this, Brazil is a bit of a hidden gem when it comes to armored vehicles. They have many interesting stuff. Nowadays, they just ordered a load of Centauros from Italy, which I really love. And their air force is really capable because of what they have. They have the AMX Ghibli, the Gripen, they have the F5, which will get a video someday. Anyway, guys, so this is it for the video. Tell me whether you liked it or not in the comments, and have a good day, everyone. Don't forget to join my Discord, and don't remember to eat your daily portions of boneless ice cream.